Let's get into it. Joining us, co-host of FAQ NYC and associate professor of political science at Fordham University, Christina Greer, Democratic strategist, pollster, and MS Now political analyst Cornell Belcher, and co-founder of the Lincoln Project, Rick Wilson. So, Cornell, President Obama, right or wrong?
Well, it's complicated. Look, and as someone who was, at least I was young back when in 2007 when we started that journey with then Senator Obama. I guess I'm old now. He's right. There was an energy, and I remember shortly after he announced one of the first kickoff events we did on the college campus, the campaign didn't even organize it. It was young people who organized it themselves. And look, young people have been a critical base of voters for Democrats, but also particularly in presidential election. And look, it's not so much that so many young people, swung a different way in the last election. You had the difference between seniors and voters under 30 was about 24 points in turnout, right? So you do see a pulling back of these young voters and making up less of the electorate, and that's a really big problem for Democrats. And look, we have a system where, for better or worse, there is both hope and there's fear. And we see on the right, they've been very successful at driving fear and mobilizing around fear. And I think to the president's point, for these younger voters and certainly voters on the left, they're less motivated by fear and more motivated by the sense of hope that President Obama gave them. And also, like, the last time our party was really remade and expanded was by a guy by the name of Jesse Jackson, who was also giving people hope, right? And rest in peace, Jesse Jackson, someone who quite frankly, Katie, a point of preference, I'm in politics right now because of Jesse Jackson. As a young man, I decided to get involved with politics because of the hope that Jesse Jackson was bringing. So I think there's a lot of point up there about hope, but not so much about age, because at the same time, Bernie Sanders would like a moment. He would like a note, because he also
So I was going to bring up Bernie Sanders in the next breath here, because I think that's right. And by the way, the Rev was just on a moment ago, Rev Al Sharpton, and he was saying that he got into politics. I think he said he was in his teenage years, 13 or 14, because of Reverend Jackson. So he inspired quite a few people, prominent, important people that are out there right now. You included, Cornell. So there's the Bernie note here. Obama makes a note to point out Mamdani. I wonder, is the key not just age, but also speaking to the moment? Mamdani spoke to the moment here in New York City, especially among younger voters who did much of what what Cornell was describing that younger people did for Obama in the early days of the campaign, got out and organized. There was an army of young people out on the streets of New York City for months, putting up Mamdani posters, canvassing for him, trying to get the word out. I mean, he was a nobody candidate in January, and he ended up winning the primary in June, which is a huge deal. So is it socialism? Is that the winning argument here?
I don't think it's socialism. Keep in mind, this time last year, Mamdani had about 1% in the polling. It's age and energy and policy. Don't forget, when we think about Mamdani winning the primary on June 24th and walking across the Brooklyn Bridge at 7 in the morning to talk to voters and hear more about their policy issues, we're not getting that from a 79-year-old candidate, right? And so the Democrats and Republicans are both...
You're getting it from Bernie?
We'll leave him aside. That's a different segment. But there's a lack of baton passing in both parties, which is quite frustrating, because not only does it clear people out of the pipeline, but I have the honor and privilege of hanging out with young people in the classroom every week, and they're saying, well, I want to get involved in politics, but there's a calcification of folks who are just in their spots, and it doesn't seem like they want to leave. So on the one hand, you've got Jerry Nadler, who says, I'm 78, it's time to pass the baton, which is fantastic that there's an open primary and there are 12 people running. But at the age of 78, my students who are in that district are saying, wow, so all those years, people who were interested in running possibly had barriers to entry. And so Mamdani succeeded, one, with a policy proposal, series of proposals for New Yorkers, but part of that's because he walked around all 5 boroughs of New York to hear what people wanted to tell him about their needs and wants for the city.
Rick, are you seeing this from anybody out there in the field right now, Democrat or Republican, beyond Mamdani here in New York?
You know, I think two things that strike me is James Tallarico has had he's burst onto the scene. It's been an amazing sort of rise to prominence by Tallarico. And you've got other candidates who are in the Democratic side coming up. They're not young, but they're also not 80, which is a big change in the chemistry that we've seen for a long time.
Yeah, I want to put up, I think we have a full screen of this. The decade that I think the past 6 presidents were born in, it's all the 1940s. It's Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Biden, Trump, all born in the 1940s. The only exception is Barack Obama, who was not born in the 40s. But, I mean, Bill Clinton, born in the 40s, fine. He was elected president in his 40s because it was the 90s. George Bush was also, was he in his late 40s? Yeah, 60. No, I'm looking at the wrong graphic. George Bush also, he was 54 when he was elected. So younger. But what is the deal with us skewing older lately? Why have we elected very, very old presidents the past few cycles? Rick.
It's a gerontocracy. I mean, we have a government basically where the median age is about 25 years older than the median age of the country. And so you see a lot of these people that are holding office in the Senate and the House, they've been holding office because they're holding on, and they do block other people from coming into government, into power. And I think that it has to become unstuck at some point. And they also, young people don't want to talk about the 400-page policy document. They want to talk about things that affect them. And I think a lot of these older candidates are not able to do that because they can't understand what's going on in the mind of a young voter right now. They don't have the cognitive connection to that generation.
Cornell.
Yeah, well, and Katie, I just want to expand on something that Rick started here. There's a structural problem, right? Between 84 and 88% of incumbents win re-election, and why do they win re-election? Because they are incumbents, and so you have money and infrastructure. Look, it costs you $4 million to run for Congress, and I'm not even talking about a Congress for a seat in anywhere near a major media market, right? And so you need that money, you need that infrastructure, and you need that support. So there are structural barriers to, say, a 34, 35-year-old who says, who's a car mechanic who says, you know what, I want to run for Congress. The structural hurdles for running for Congress are as high as I think they've ever been, and there's way too much. And look, I earn a living from money in politics, Katie, but there's way too much money dictating our politics right now in this country.
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely right. And it's really difficult to get around that. It's difficult to have a conversation where you don't account for that, because, I mean, the question I want to ask you is, do you need a candidate who is not only younger and more in touch and maybe talking about economics and costs and focusing on affordability, but is also not so out of step on social issues with the part of the country that they want to represent? And is that a moot conversation to have because of what Cornell was just saying? The barriers that are put in place for most people to run for office.
Right. I mean, I agree with Cornell. There are definitely some real structural barriers, especially with young people. I mean, the minimum age to run for Congress is 25. But, I mean, how many 25-year-olds have a network of people that could donate to them? So some of it is messaging. I think we also have to think about what type of office you're running for. So I always encourage my students to think about city council, to think about state houses, where there's a lot of money and power that goes through state houses. And even in an important state like New York, there are people who are sometimes getting elected and reelected with 3,000 and 4,000 votes because people just don't even bother to pay attention to these very important positions where billions of dollars in the state of New York pass through state houses, and then you work your way up through the pipeline. I think some of it is just a lack of education to know of all the elected offices that are possible for people to run in. A lot of people just know president, governor, senator, and they sort of conflate senator and Congress instead of House and Senate. But there are a lot of pipeline positions where you can actually learn how to be a good candidate. You can learn how to be a good public servant. You can learn about policy. You don't have to just jump to D.C. to start.
Councilman or councilperson is a good place to start.